Well, good morning, and we're here for part three. Okay, so in the last two parts have been fascinating. In this one, we're going to pick up on some thoughts about possible reasons meaning is being marginalized by the SOR folks, some of them. Um, and also we'll talk about big tech financing, and that's the one. Boy, when I was at LitCon and you presented that information, there were a lot of people that just like jaw dropped. Okay, so some jaw dropping things on that, and finally, the whole business of gosh, let's bring teachers back into teaching, huh? The teacher autonomy and expertise, and paying attention to the fact that research demonstrates clearly that teachers make more difference in programs. Motivation matters. So I don't want to steal any more of your thunder. Now we know what we're about to talk about. It's all you. Take it over.
Okay. Well, Sam, if I get off track, you corral me back in, all right?
Okay, that's my job.
Now, in fairness to your audience, they're probably wondering, oh gosh, last week in part two, Dr. Hruby had a mustache. What did it fall off? And no, Dr. Sam is good enough to allow me to re-record this part three because I wasn't kind of happy with I wasn't being as clear as I thought I ought to be, and I don't want to get this wrong because these are important points. I mean, part one about the neuroscience, that's important too. Part two, where we talked about theories of reading comprehension, that's very important. I strongly feel that reading comprehension is going to be making a comeback pretty soon when people wonder why phonics first and only doesn't magically make everyone good readers on that end of third grade standardized state reading test and on up through the grade levels and on the NAEP and so forth. And we talked about why that was in miniature, simple view of reading. Reading is the product of decoding skills and language comprehension ability. And if you don't have both of those things, you're in trouble. So only emphasizing the decoding skills in early reading and to the exclusion of language comprehension ability development, or even outlawing it, as in some states, like in Ohio and other states that have begun passing the exclusion of ostensibly the three queuing system, but really the as you'll see, uh, preventing teaching based on meaning. So, which is strange. So, I guess where do I want to begin? Will be regarding all this fuss. Let's see here. I may share my screen with
Okay.
the science of reading. Um, so the science of reading sounds reasonable, right? Phonics is important. We've all learned it, but there are lots of different ways to teach it. And no one way is perfect for all kids at all times. Kids are differ, and kids differ not only between themselves, but they differ in relation to themselves over time. So a good teacher hoists a heavy toolkit and has many ways to teach phonics, and has many ways to teach all the other important components, which we talked about in the first two parts of this.
Okay,
Uh,
you said I could interrupt you, and I
yeah,
will right here because you just made the point of points there. I've many a time said that it's not a matter of whether phonics, although I know there are some people out there that say no phonics or have said no phonics. Those folks these days are few and far between. It's not a matter of whether phonics, it's a matter of what kind and how much, and remembering that the classroom is a zero sum game in terms of time. So if you overdo the time for phonics, you're going to underdo something else. So that means that there are real limits on just how much time there is. And some of the programs that are being put out there, if you do them according to their ways of doing them, you're not going to have time left for anything else. So I guess my big thing here is that I've been preaching this for a long time. It's not whether, it's how much and what kind. Okay. And now, I'm sorry,
Right.
I just had to get on my
No, no,
soapbox
no,
again.
that's actually true. And when you have these pre-paced structured programs that assume that all kids need the exact same thing at the exact same time and at the exact same rate of progression. And gosh, what an easy job it would be to be an early elementary teacher if that were the case. But it's not the case, and that's the challenge. And when you begin mastering all those moving parts, the gratification of being an elementary school teacher, teaching reading. But yeah, but as I say, the problem is that if you do that to the exclusion of other things that matter, given there's only so many hours in a day, so many dollars in the till, and so when you're devoting your resources to one thing, you suffer what are known as opportunity costs. You don't have those resources for other things that also matter a lot. And you don't want to forget that kids, um, let's say kids differ, but our students who most need the support of our schools, those who are, as they sometimes say, and I hate this term, at risk by virtue of being the children of intergenerational low literacy levels, intergenerational under supported schooling, or students who are historically marginalized minority groups, or new emigres to the U.S. who are just learning English, for instance. All of these students are at greater risk to struggle, and certainly their chances of succeeding are improved greatly if they have not just phonics instruction, which is relatively easy whether they understand the language or not, but comprehension development, language comprehension development, and so here's an example. This is the Ohio legal code, where it's the revised code. And this is about implementing the science of reading. And it defines what the science of reading is. But in the yellow highlighted areas, you can see the exclusion. Science of reading is any approach to reading that does not rely on any model of teaching students to read based on meaning, structure, and syntax, and which is grammar, and visual cues. And of course, they're not defined visual cues. So one would presume what that means is, of course, the letter sequences on the page. So not only does this prohibit language comprehension, it prohibits decoding. It prohibits phonics. That you can't do these things. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet, this has been a model and been adopted in several other states and has been proposed in several states, hasn't passed in all of the states, but it's there. And it's just really obstinate. And it makes one wonder what the issues really are. Is this really about the science of reading, or is this about some kind of ideological obsession, or some sort of political stratagem to to guarantee that kids who come to school at risk of low school achievement because of low reading achievement, because of a less well developed language development, will continue to languish until you finally let them read for meaning in sixth grade, or in Ohio, I think it's seventh grade, by which time, of course, uh, they're so far behind, they don't care anymore. They've identified themselves as poor readers, and what's the point? And you see these kids in middle schools with their heads on the desk, and they've just given up. And there are a lot of other things going on as well. It's not just their reading instruction, but our schools. When you begin identifying people as those who need to be marginalized, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm very worried about that. So, what is driving this kind of crazy extremism, phonics extremism, if you will? Is it politics? Is it ideology? Or is it money? I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not a social theorist, but David Reinking and Vicky Risco and I did a piece that was in Teachers College Record, January of 2023, in which we talked about the political polemics that seems to be displacing seriously and well-informed professional development. And we gave Tennessee as an example. And we talked about the fact that there seemed to be an ideological underpinning. Now, just what do we mean by ideology? Well, ideology is a belief system you have um, in advance of any hard evidence. So most people have beliefs about human nature or about human development or about the nature of change, whether it's desirable or whether it even occurs. Some people have sort of a static universe ideology. Some people are very much about progressive, linear advance, and so on. And so there's different ways to think about that. If you look at some of the forms of PD that are being mandated by state legislation that gives a limited approved list of for-profit products, some of these, and I'm immediately, thinking of something like the Letters program, go on for quite a while, 2 years for the Letters program. And so far, the research studies that have been done on the impact of this on the teacher's students' reading achievement shows that there's no effect. I was just at the American Educational Research Association annual meeting in Philadelphia last week, and a very fastidious researcher from the University of Oregon, Brian Guerin, who was doing work on for Lexia, and he was looking at the data available from Colorado, and they looked at early adapting, mainstream adapting, and late adapting districts, and whether there was any difference in the effect of their in of the of when they adopted, and there wasn't any difference um, between those factors. But the most startling thing he acknowledged was that there was no impact in any case on students' reading achievement for 2 years worth of that PD training. Now that's unfortunate, and that's not a new finding. That was a similar study done back in, I think, 2006, found the same thing, which then makes you wonder, well, why spend so much money on a program that isn't going to improve the students' teaching? But if you look at the content of that program, or the Tennessee 360 program, as Ryan King and Risco and I did, then you'll see that there is clearly an ideological belief system at work as to what students need, what reading is, and what you probably would better off avoiding. You could say that all three of these things are not mutually exclusive. All three of these things can be at work. In this model, what I've got laid out here is that ideology and politics are the wing supports for money, because I think it's money and socioeconomic status that is driving this more than anything. Um, and I should say that, as I say, these things are not mutually exclusive. Ideology provides the justifications very often for political acts, but in this case, the political acts seem to be done precisely to guarantee a guaranteed income for certain companies, certain corporations, and certain asset management funds that own those corporations. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. Some of the people who combine these three things are a little off to stage left, or actually stage right, I suppose I should say. I'm thinking of people like Mark Andreessen of Andreessen and Horowitz, Ben Horowitz, and his techno-optimist manifesto, which optimist sounds good, but if you actually read the manifesto, it's terrifying. His stance, and this is a guy who founded a Netscape, and uh, he's he's very wealthy, very influential, and he believes democracy is a failure, and what we need to have is the tech finance kings as the new aristocracy to impose their will and leadership upon the masses. And this idea that the masses are asses and democracy is a failure is repeated over and over again. The conservative political action conference that's held annually in Washington D.C. This just this past year, Jack Posobiec gave a speech in which he called for an end to democracy. That's unthinkable in a mainstream political party, but there it was. You've got philosophers, techno philosophers like Curtis Yarvin or Nick Land, who've called for the end of democracy and insisted on its failure. Peter Thiel, right, or Elon Musk. These are tech titans, and they have this same belief system. And then people like academics like Patrick Dean and folks like that, and they all kind of want this neo-medievalist um, world, pre-enlightenment, a pre-modern world. That I mean, you think they must be pulling your leg, but it's really serious. And what's a major support of democracy anyway? And where do people get the idea that they have the right to consent of the governed and the Bill of Rights and so on? Well, they get it from public education. That's why we have public education. So cutting public education down at the knees, and particularly the ability to make sense of texts like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution or your daily newspaper, would be a key plank. Now, I don't know if I can buy that because it just seems so way out there, but you read the work of these people, and that is way out there too. It's like Unabomber territory, and yet these are multi-millionaires, billionaires, and tech titans. And you wonder just what is where this is all going to lead. So it sounds like a fringe thing, but it's really not. Let me give you an example of how the money of the tech finance world works. The Wall Street Journal calls this fintech, but I'll just call it big tech, big finance. And this is just one example because there are other examples. Just about anything that is mandated in those programs, just about all, are ultimately owned by a private equity firm in California or a hedge fund in New York. And this is one example. Veritas Capital is a hedge fund in New York, and it specializes in companies owning companies that are the sort of the premier source for government technology security and surveillance. And if you can go to their website, and it'll give you the whole lowdown of their mission and their vision. And in 2018, when the prices were right, they bought Cambium Learning. And this is a company that specializes in online education. And they had learning A to Z and Kurzweil learning. And a Voyager Sopris, which of course was the publisher of the material for the Letters program. And the reason why the price was right was that some of your listeners may recall that there was a big deal about technology in the schools as making things so much better, and MOOCs for the colleges of education, and it all sort of belly flopped. And the studies that were coming out in the mid-teens showed that it didn't work any better than garden variety reading instruction, or garden variety instruction with a real living teacher in the classroom rather than by way of a video from the Khan Academy or what have you. And in one case, there were serious negative results. So it was so valuations were low. It was a good time to snap up Cambium Learning. Well, as you know, in 2019, along comes COVID, and the schools shut down in 2020, depending on the state, for various amounts of time. Everyone has got to get online, and many places, I know in Lexington, Kentucky, where I am, the schools already had Chromebooks and tablets in the hands of their students, because they were already going full tilt on the technology. So they were able to use that during the pandemic closures. But it wasn't a very satisfying way to learn, and it wasn't an equitable way either, because a lot of places didn't have the technology. But with that came the promise of funding for technology. And with that, you begin to see things happening. In 2020, Cambium Learning buys Rosetta Stone, which is an online foreign language company. Part of Rosetta Stone was a division called Lexia, which was its learning division, and Cambium peeled that off of Rosetta Stone, matched it with Voyager Sopris for what they called in a press release their super brand, in March of 21, Lexia Learning, and it produced, it was now taking on Letters, and Motes and Tolman sold the rights to Letters at around this time as well for about $125 million. And at exactly the same time that they created this, KBM sold Rosetta Stone because without Lexia, they didn't want it, and they sold it to IXL. And some of you may know IXL from those big smart boards at the front of the classroom and the whole system that they have there. A lot of worksheets, basically. But it's and that group is owned by Publicis Group in Paris, I believe, France. So in any case, Voyager, Sopris, and Lexia became the major corporate sponsors for the International Dyslexia Association's annual conference. Used to be Orton Gillingham companies, but they were down to one company, Wilson Reading, which I'm pretty sure is now owned by Nexus Group. They bought that from the Wilsons for about 150 million. But yeah, between Wilson Reading and Lexia, those are the major corporate sponsors of IDA. And of course, IDA owns the registered trademark at the U.S. Patent Office for structured literacy, and it's essentially the same idea. Only now, many of the what were Orton Gillingham based dyslexia remediation programs have been repackaged as all-purpose reading programs, such is the emphasis on phonics in the schools. You can do that without blinking an eye and think it's the same thing.
Hey,
In
I'd like to chime in here just briefly
Sure.
about the uh, term structured literacy, which is trademarked. And if you look back into the origins of that, the origins of that is from, and I'll provide a link in the blog to make sure that I'm not just making this up. Uh, it was a term that was created by the International Dyslexia Association, and that term was created for the main purpose of public relations. And it turns out that the president of that association at that time was a public relations expert. So while this term did not come, this was not a research term, this was a public relations term. And I think that that fact has been lost on a lot of people. And I just wanted to emphasize it.
Yeah. So I mean, so by structured, you've got something that's pre-paced. And as the individual you're talking about, Hal Malcho, what he said is, this is how we can sell what we do. And of course, what where the sales were going to be, as everyone was assuming at this point, is online. So, but then at the beginning of 22, uh, Cambium buys the American Institute for Research's assessment division, which had a wonderful website where you could go and get research-based information on all the assessments that you might possibly use for any subject, any grade level, any special student group. And and it was wonderful for district leaders who needed to make those kinds of decisions, and especially if you're going to go with online assessment now. But unfortunately, not everybody did very well by the lights of that research. And there was a lot of different research studies that they were bringing together there. And KBM bought it and said they were going to update it, and they never did. It's never reappeared, and instead created KBM Assessment, which simply has a website that assures you that their assessments are all research based. Just after that, same year, 22, Veritas Capital bought and took private Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is itself is a huge corporation that's the result of the merger of three very large publishing companies: Houghton Mifflin, Harcourt Brace, and Holt Reinhardt and Winston. And so that brought together a whole lot of materials, including Into Reading, which and certainly New York folks in New York know this, but many other states as well. It's the most used early elementary reading curriculum that meets science of reading expectations. So that was pretty good. And then a year later, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt bought Northwest Education Association, which owns and handles the MAP tests, the most commonly used progress monitor for reading and math for the elementary grades. And also it goes beyond. And So they, this is very surprising. Usually, a hedge fund buys a company and rips it apart, but Veritas is actually assembling a huge beachhead here in response to the needs of the schools during the pandemic, and I think that in itself is a commendable thing. But let's not forget the reason why this is being done, because there's money in them thar hills. I've not been able to find any evidence that the reason why the founder of Veritas Capital or the other investors in Veritas Capital, including like Deutsche Bank, they don't stay awake at night worrying about how to teach elementary kids their phonics. Their issue is about market share. Their issue is about profits. Their issue is about capital trajectories, and that's their jobs. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not evil. But if you're calling the shots on the basis alone as to what is most profitable, which, as it turned out, is whatever could be most easily delivered online, and what is most easily delivered online, given our current technology, as amazing as it is low-level skill drilling in a sort of a Skinnerian behaviorist operational conditioning model. And that's the reason why you don't see the emphasis on comprehension, because that requires a sustained time with students reading extended texts, writing and rewriting and editing, having discussions, sharing their thoughts, developing their speaking and listening skills, developing, in other words, their language familiarity and their symbolic reasoning and their content knowledge. And those are the things that matter when you take one of those end of year reading comprehension tests. So it's really and so it's put everyone at a disadvantage. And if you're wondering why we haven't seen a rebound in reading scores as we were promised, and keep in mind, kids now who are taking that end of year third grade test this spring were just in kindergarten when the pandemic hit. So they surely should have caught up by now, and we don't see it. It may be that having all of this technology infrastructure and the low-hanging fruit of skill drilling instruction and worksheets for the older grades has not, it's been as effective as it was when we did it in the past, and it's never been very effective. How much money are we talking about here, Sam? You remember when reading first was around and people got all excited because there was $5 billion being dedicated to it nationwide with George Bush. When Bill Clinton came around, we had an economic crisis, and he tried to have an economic stimulus package to fire up the entire U.S. economy. And it was $61 billion. And the Congress shot it down because it was too much money. But between the Trump and Biden administration, two presidential terms, the U.S. has spent $190 billion on post-pandemic learning lag relief schools nationwide. That's how much was put out on the table. And again, that's not evil. That's wonderful. All that money. Imagine what you could do with it. But what was done with it is it was, according to the Wall Street Journal article, from which I get this figure, New York Times says it's 185 billion. Well, I'll let them argue about that. But in other words, it's a lot of money. Just how much money is it? Well, I'm going to, and I said this at LitCon, and I wasn't, your listeners are very smart people. And even those who are handy with math and quantitative analysis, you aren't that far at Walmart when you go up to somebody and ask, how much is $1 million? They go, well, that's a lot of money. So, well, how much is $1 billion? Oh, that's some more money. Yeah, well, let's be a little more precise. Imagine $100,000. If you're part of a two-income earning family, you probably earn around $100,000, maybe a little less, a little more. And you certainly probably know someone in upper administration in the government who's certainly earning a six-figure income. So $100,000 isn't that hard to imagine. Um, so fine. How long would it take you at the rate of $100,000 a year to earn $1 million? Well, it would take 10 years. 10 years is not an unimaginable amount of time. $100,000 is not an unimaginable amount of money. So $1 million is something that you can kind of imagine. All right. How long would it take at the rate of $100,000 a year to earn $1 billion. And before you reach for your phone, let me tell you in advance, it's 10,000 years. Okay. Now, that is all of recorded human history and twice as much unrecorded prehistory. Okay. 10,000 years ago, I mean, you're not going to live that long. And 10,000 years ago, you couldn't have earned $100,000 because we didn't have currency. We didn't have trade. We didn't have towns. We didn't have agriculture. We were the closest we were at that point was sort of managing wild stands of einkorn, which was a Middle Eastern grain that's sort of the progenitor of today's modern strains of wheat and barley. We didn't have animal husbandry. We didn't have metal. Not even copper. Our tools are made of bone or stone or wood. And we were all hunter gatherers. So that's how long. So it's an unfathomable amount of time. It's an unfathomable amount of money, and we're talking $190 billion. Look at all those zeros, and those aren't nothings, right? So who in the world knows how to manage this kind of money? And the answer is the financial community, in the Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and so on. And that's their job. And they do it well, hopefully. And we're having a soft landing with our inflation, and let's all hope for the best. But
Okay, once again, I'm going to interrupt you just briefly to say this is where you could have heard a pin drop in the
yeah,
room when
well,
you
this is the
presented the
motivation.
information.
This is the motivation for buying up all of those companies, because all of those companies were well situated. And as I say, the Wall Street Journal says that the number one use for this money was a technology infrastructure. The second most common use is health infrastructure and supplies and so on, air filtration systems and so forth, and more health personnel. Right? And then the third largest use were the materials and the programs that you have to pay for. Right now, keep in mind why this online stuff is so lucrative. In the first place, you don't have to pay for any printing costs, storage costs, transportation costs, right? It's all electronic. So that's very lucrative. Secondly, it's very lucrative because you don't actually sell it to anyone to own. You lease it. Right now, you're hearing a lot of people talk about the need for more content knowledge. This is a throat clearing for the hard sell that's coming. Mark my words, for selling textbooks. And textbooks are very, very expensive. But these days, they don't seem so expensive because they're e-texts. But they come aligned with all kinds of tests and teacher guides and everything else. So you have to buy the whole kit, and you pay for it on a lease basis. And the minute you stop paying, you lose everything. So the old days where you would buy a text set and you had a copy machine and you could recopy the worksheets, recopy the test, those days are gone. The fact that you could use the same textbooks year over year for too many years, probably, those days are gone. Now it's you have to pay up the rent. So that's very, very lucrative. And there's a third reason why this online approach is so lucrative, and that's because all of the data that the companies are sucking up from the students using their programs on their digital platforms, keystroke by keystroke, eye glance by eye glance, pause by pause, and verbal mutterings, with microphones and eye glance, if there's cameras involved, and there are, all these devices. And what are they going to use all of that for? There's nobody is signing any informed consent, but it's going to the parents to allow it. It's just being taken. I don't want to get paranoid, but what would you use it for? Well, they say they use it to improve their products. But the truth of the matter is it creates these huge data banks that then they can sell on the open market to the highest bidder for whatever purpose that bidder wants to use it for. And it's basically about surveillance and control and figuring out how best to package messages to sell things, and in this case, with children. So to me, this concern for profits over the welfare of the end user is very concerning. This is how big pharma gave us the opioid crisis, right down to funding researchers to produce research that showed that opioids weren't addictive, right? This is how big tobacco gave us the cancer crisis, right down to funded researchers producing research that showed that nicotine was not habit forming, right? This is how big oil gave us the plastics crisis, and so it's very worrisome to me. And I say I'm not an economist, but this doesn't bode well for our future. So where are we going? The money runs out this fiscal year. That'll be this summer. This is the last fiscal year that districts and schools, states can apply to the federal government for this funding. So it's done now. Um, the states on their own will not be able to afford the systems they bought into: maintenance, upgrades, subscriptions, student devices, all those big, those news stories you heard about 100 million from, for Tennessee, 120 million in Ohio, and so forth. And so 90 million in Atlanta, Fulton County alone, right? That where's that money come from? It's coming from the federal government, from this post-pandemic funding, most of it. So what's going to happen? Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal. Pandemic cash that bolstered school budgets is about to run out. And schools have tens of billions in COVID relief left, but a fiscal cliff looms. They might get through this coming fall, but by next fall, there's going to be a lot of sweating because, again, you rent this stuff, and if you don't keep paying, it disappears. Um, so will these asset management funds that have bought up all of the product producers slip away into the night? Sell these things off as initial public offerings and, priced on the basis of the record profits that they've been getting over the past 3 years. If they do so, there are mutual and pension fund managers who are going to buy it up because they have to. They're supposed to. They're required to buy whatever has seems to proven to be the most lucrative thing. But when the valuations fall because the Fed funding ends, that's not going to be such a good deal. They're going to be left holding the bag. So if you're a private mutual fund investor, don't do it. Uh, or will the current situation, where all of the science of reading funding has propped up this, as some have called it, a boondoggle, will it be propped up by the federal government? Senator Cassidy of Louisiana circulated a request to a response for a report by the HELP Committee on the science of reading. HELP stands for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Bernie Sanders is the chair of that committee, but Cassidy is the senior Republican on the committee. And I suspect that what they're, sort of testing the waters to see whether there's any appetite for the feds to come to the rescue. It would, in many ways, be helpful. But if you recall that there was a very long delay in the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act because Congress wanted the White House out of education policy. As you may recall, George Bush with Leave No Child Behind began offering money to entice states to follow things like reading first. Barack Obama did the same thing with Race to the Top. And of course, the National Governors Association and the Council for Chief State School Officers did that with Common Core standards. And so the question is, will the feds come to the rescue again? And if they do, what will they want in return? I imagine that a committee headed by Bernie Sanders and with lots of prominent Democrats on it will want a more comprehensive approach to reading instruction. At least I hope they will, after the responses they've been getting as a result of Senator Cassidy's call. I know Kara Lee and a group of scholars from the Reading Hall of Fame sent in a response. And I know many individual scholars did as well. So they'll know what they need to do. And the question is, will they do it? And will Congress agree to allow the feds to get back in the game and fund this? But then the question is, where's that money to come from? So, will science of reading continue as it has with no changes, or with changes, such as more emphasis on comprehension and the products related to it? Will there ever be a post-pandemic bounce in reading scores, given the current science of reading approach? When K through 2 reading instruction is evaluated with how the students do in third, fourth, and fifth grade at their end of year comprehension tests, those tests don't measure K through 2. They're measuring 3 through 5 and beyond. Will we get a bounce with the teacher attrition rates, which are sky high right now, where especially highly qualified reading teachers are just disappearing from the field? And there's lots of misinformation about why that is. Part of the reason is they're tired of being sidelined as room monitors while the technology takes over the teaching and does it badly because they know they'll get blamed for the result. Will we get a bounce when the impact of digital learning and social media on students' mental health is very well documented now and may also impact their cognitive ability development because depression and stress and trauma undermine learning? I mean, neurologically, we talked about neuroscience last time. That's another factor. That's different from the effect neurologically of language experience, but because we talked about that a lot of time as well. I think I forgot to mention Fibla and colleagues' work in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2023 on language exposure and brain myelination in early language development. But it's a real it's a crucial thing. And will we get a bounce when state mandates de-emphasize or even eliminate reading for meaning, vocabulary, knowledge, and reasoning, sideline writing, sideline multimodality? You know, don't look at those pictures. How about the people listening to this? Are they looking at the pictures? Did I take the trouble of creating these slides for nothing? Well, no. So I wouldn't panic. It is going to get better. I saw this in the Detroit airport, so I had to snap a picture of it on my phone. So yes, technology can do wonderful things. I am pretty sure that whether the asset management uh, overseers um, slip away or stay the distance, I am sure that when it's brought to their attention that they're not getting the results they had promised everyone, that they'll want to do the right thing. They're not bad people, I don't think. They're not all Mark Andreessen. And I think that certainly just from the standpoint of marketing, you don't want to be seen as negligent of children's well-being, certainly their educational well-being. The techno financial elites may indeed despise we the people, but I don't think that that's a good sales tactic for their products. So I think they will make a greater effort, and I think therefore we will see a more comprehensive approach to reading education in the future. So I'll just end with these basic principles. Remember that children differ. Some need more time before they're ready to start learning to read. Some need more time once they start learning to read. Some need more support. Some will top out a little later than others and to different degrees. But that's, you know, the people differ. And that's not a failing. That's not a defect. It's not a design flaw. It's a feature. All students can learn to read and deserve to do so. And claiming that anyone who is not proficient, which if you look it up in a dictionary means exceedingly talented, exceedingly expert, mastery. Okay, that's what proficient means. And to say that if you're not doing that, you're not reading at all is absurd. It's utterly improbable. And, you know, using inference to try to determine what a word means in a text, that's not guessing the word. It's using, you know, good logical reasoning, and we all do it. No student should be denied needed support to achieve desired educational outcomes, but they need support that complements their abilities. You work with their strengths to build on what they need more help with. And I believe I gave an example last time that looking at a group of second graders who were behind their peers in reading, and they weren't special ed, and they weren't English language learners. That less than half had trouble with phonological accuracy, but nearly 70% had trouble with fluency, and only a third of those had trouble with accuracy. So, what was the problem with the other two-thirds? They needed more practice reading. They're not getting enough of the school day because that takes time away from the screen, oddly enough, to just sit there and read a book, or just sit there and read a short story, or to write a story and draft it. Now, I think with large language models and AI, we're going to see more incorporation of that into the educational products, and potentially that may be very useful, but we don't have it yet. And finally, I'll say all children deserve language development support pre-K through college. And this is a touchy topic because sometimes people misunderstand it. And I appreciate the fact, Sam, that last time you reminded everyone at the beginning of the part two that what I'm talking about is true for any language and any dialect. I am not suggesting that the better language development is about formal school English or suburban white English. But what I am suggesting is that the more vocabulary you have and the greater range of grammatical patterns that you're familiar with and can understand and use fluently, that correlates with your reasoning ability, and not surprisingly, then your content knowledge and how well you do as a reader and how well you do in school, and quite possibly how well you're going to do in life. And I know there are people who say, well, that's culturally insensitive. There are people who don't use language that much. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, those are groups that have been historically marginalized by groups that have dominated them and oppressed them. And the impact of that, one would assume, would be traumatic. And trauma leads to depression. Poverty leads to depression. Jerome Keegan at Harvard found that the number one correlate for depression is poverty and the trauma that comes along with it. And one of the leading, of course, characteristics of depression is a lack of talkativeness and social emotional interaction. So if you have parents suffering from that through no fault of their own, and even middle class parents can find themselves in a bind. Someone loses a job, someone, a dear grandparent dies or something, but that's temporary usually, and they rebound. But people who suffer from this intergenerationally because they're being targeted are, and because they've been kept intergenerationally low literate by a school system that doesn't serve them and wants to label them, as disabled. And as a result, what we will do is accommodate them rather than actually educate them. And the sooner we do that, we're told, the better it will be for everyone. That is just so wrong. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, well, an amazing amount, an amazing set of 2 cents there. Let me throw in my nickel here, and that has to do with I am very much pro technology, not anti technology, and I don't think you're anti technology either. But I made my first presentation about technology in 1995 at an ILA convention. And at that time, I talked about Mindstorms by Seymour Papert. And
I
Papert,
remember that.
and Papert was kind of like the beginning of all this. And from the get go, Papert said computers need to be tools of the mind. And when you use computers that way, then great things happen. If you use them to be worksheets, if you use them for what you call the low hanging fruit, then not so much. And so we've known this from the outset. And I part of this also is that computer programs are tools, and how one uses a tool is very important. So I've used some of the, I'm not going to name them because I'm not trying to sell products or anything. I've used some of the very products that you listed on your slide, and I still do. But I use them as a tool, and I use them as a tool of the mind. And if you look at it from that standpoint, then computers and all the technology are going to be a wonderful thing. On the other hand, if you use it to make electronic flashcards and go for that low hanging fruit, then you're not going to get much at all, except for a lot of people rich who are
Right.
making some really terrible programs.
Right.
So that's my 2 cents worth. Uh,
On the one hand, you can say, well, were in a crunch. The schools had to shut down immediately. We had to rush things to the table. Okay, yeah, I'll buy that. And we were also had just faced a moment of truth because what we had done in the teens with technology hadn't worked very well. We didn't have time to start from scratch. So they rushed things in. But as that's the thing. When you got $190 billion waiting to be claimed, you're going to just throw whatever you can. I mean, look, meanwhile, there was also tons of funding that went out to businesses to continue to hire their employees in spite of having to shut down your business, right? And that sort of thing. And there's been more, they've discovered more corruption and thieving with phony applications because they were just throwing the money out. They were desperate not to have, their real concern was that the economy overall would collapse. And it didn't, amazingly. And we have managed to rebound. So I think that's great. And I'm sure technology it can. Yeah, back with you say Seymour Papert. Back then, I was a doctoral student, and I remember at the time, Don Liu, who was at Syracuse University, and then he went to the University of Connecticut. But at the time, he was editing a special issue of uh, review. No, let's see, was it a journal of research and instruction, reading research and instruction. That was it. Reading research. Today, it's literacy research and instruction. But it was reading research and instruction back then. And in the special issue about technology and reading instruction, that a number of the authors who contributed, myself being one of them, pointed out that um, what is being done is formative. We're kind of experimenting as we go in real time. We're kind of building the boat as we sail it. But ultimately, what will last will be that which is effective, that which is actually productive. You know, this is what Uri Levin came out with his book, Love the Problem, Not the Solution. There are too many technology engineers who devise real nifty apps and other gimmicks, and then they go looking for some problem to solve with it. It's better if you start with the problem and the needs of your potential customers and then devise something for them. And so I think we got a lot of stuff like that in this past boondoggle. And I keep calling it a boondoggle. That's not anything against the financial or technology industries. That's against the state legislatures. I mean, when a correspondent of mine tells me that they went to talk to their legislator, and the legislator said, "I'm sorry, honey, you're too late. The science of reading people have already been through here, and they've got all of us sold on this stuff, and we don't really understand what we're voting for. We're going to vote for it anyway. And hey, look, I just got a check in my campaign war chest for $4,000, which is twice as much as anybody else gave me. It it doesn't take a lot of financial support at the state level to win a vote. So, that's a boondoggle. That's unfortunate. It's a proud American tradition, but we're not talking small amounts of money here.
Okay,
So
I'm going to put you on the spot with one final question. And
sure.
a lot of my readers are teachers. A lot of my readers are teachers that are exactly the kind of teacher you were talking about that don't want to become a room monitor, that uh, we are not appreciating what they can and should do. We're not appreciating the decades of research that shows that teachers make more difference than programs, and we've known that since forever. And we're not acting that out. So, any words of comfort or hope for teachers that some of us are still staying at it, some of us are still staying in the field? Do you see some hope? And what can we do to help empower teachers to become teachers and not room monitors?
Well, the teachers need to be advocates. And I mean, look, if you're thinking about leaving the field anyway, what can you lose by speaking up? Your job? You're going to leave the field anyway. So go ahead, speak up on the way out, but don't leave. Speak up and, be professional about it, and be informed about it. Teacher autonomy is crucial. As I said, kids differ in what they need. And a good teacher develops the skills with the wide array of methods and tools and technologies to address those needs. Um, and no one knows better than the teacher in the classroom what those kids need. No one knows better than a teacher in a classroom what the kids who've come through her classroom year over year over year in that particular district, in that particular school, at that particular grade level happen to need. Instead of having copywriters in New York or San Francisco or Santa Monica, wherever they are, cooking up these great structured, scripted programs, would it let the good teachers responsibly do what they need to do and provide teachers the professional development that doesn't tell them what to do, training them for the new program, but that develops their instructional problem solving skills so that they can decide for themselves, given the teachers and the students and challenges they have right there in front of them. But they need to be advocates for what they're doing as well. We've seen teacher unions getting bashed. We've seen even just teacher associations. They're not even unions. They're nonprofits. They can't do collective bargaining. They're just there so that teachers can share their wisdom. That stuff has been badmouthed and shut down. Um, I mean, we need to stand up respectfully on behalf of the kids, on behalf of the schools, on behalf of our communities and our families. We, the people, need to step up and remind the elite in New York or Silicon Valley, the private equity people and the venture capitalists. We need to remind them that consent of the governed is a long-standing principle of Anglophone government, and it goes back probably at least to the Danelaw, and certainly Magna Carta and since. And this terrible, horrible techno-optimist fantasy that we're going to have a neo-medieval world where they're going to get to be the knights at the round table and the rest of us are going to return to serfdom, uneducated and illiterate, is just the ugliest and creepiest and frankly dumbest, unimaginative fantasy I've ever heard anyone vomit up on an internet screen. But yeah, it's a free country. Let's keep it free, and we need our teachers to do that.
What a perfect note to end on. Thank you. So, you've done several of these interviews with me, and thank you so much for that. My final silly little tradition. So it's time to put on our big smiles and our big wave and do a Zoom wave goodbye. And thank you so much. And that ends part 3.